Quiver, New Weapons for Thought, post-Elysian political project that takes thinking to be an instrument of combat. Unapologetically queer, feminist, anti-capitalist, and abolitionist.
So thanks everyone for coming this week. What is this, our 7th Quiver so far? So we've been going well. It's finally exploring topics beyond just sort of the original provocations or readings, which I love. The people who are able to join us every week seems to still be shifting and changing a bit, and there's definitely a committed group now. But if there are things that we want to change, like if we want to do a large outreach drive or we want to get more people, I'm sure we can do that as well. Our email list is quite strong. It's maybe 350, 400 people. And so I think in the spirit of the readings today as well, you might imagine what other things could Quiver be? Not just this sort of reading or writing, which maybe in some ways as a mirror reflects the challenges that Fanon and Azoulay had when trying to transform the clinic. And one of their main initiatives was to create a newsletter to explain to the patients why and how the activities and the forms of therapeutic interventions they were using worked, which they thought would be sort of, educational or communicational tool. But they also tried to have the patients themselves participate and even take over parts of it. And the difficult nature of all of it was that it worked with the half of the patients, which were the European section. This was in North Africa. The European section took quite well to this. They were literate. They loved the newsletter, the clubs, the activities, the knitting, and the other forms of therapy that were occurring. But the Muslim patients sort of humored the clinicians for a short time, got bored, and then just stopped. And so that's where we're sort of at with the reading, but maybe this is the lesson that we have for the reading group as well. If it's too specific, if it's too rarefied, if it only attracts to a certain group of people who are deeply committed just to the practices of, let's say, reading and writing, we're missing what might be the whole transformation, not just the sort of social dimensions that, even 70 years ago for them included a film club with a very smartly curated film series, but also sports. But then when they started digging deeper, they thought, hey, maybe we need to understand where tea fits in people's everyday life, given their cultural context. We need to imagine the way in which storytelling is really important, is something that's sort of missed and destroyed by colonizers who want to turn everything into written history. So maybe that's something that we have to ask ourselves as well through the course of this session and going on. Sort of, what do we imagine to be the intervention simply because we were told that these are the ways that things work, with books? I love books. So I'm certainly not going to knock books, but like, what are the other ways of life that we should incorporate, given what our goals, or what we think, the true fashioning of something less from a tool but into a weapon to make a sharp strategic intervention, a tactical intervention, I guess. Anyway, those are my very brief remarks. We've fortunately got Gustavo this week, who so generously and graciously sat with the texts and offered to introduce them and help facilitate some of the conversation today. So without any further ado, I'd love to pass it over to Gustavo.
And Liliana as well, no?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that thank you, Andrew and Dana, and I just want to be brief. A lot of why I volunteered very quickly, because I would love to have a little bit longer time with the text, is that Liliana has been kind of my spirit angel for the last, 8 years, following her dissertation track and her teaching. But it was kind of an awakening, and it was a painful awakening for me, I guess. Because in art school, I was exposed to philosophy, but Western and French theory. And I thought that was, transgressive and revolutionary. but sometimes you don't like look at the mirror closely and look at yourself. And I thought that was what this Fanon and some of the work with decolonialism and post-coloniality has given me, is this power to really look at every institution for what it is. Are they helping people? Are they helping the hearts and the generations of I would say souls that have sacrificed their lives? And so Liliana, briefly, everyone knows me, but Liliana, Dr. Gallegos, she's a force of nature, but this is a lot of her research. And I think what we're going to try to do is I'll present some things, but feel free, Liliana, anytime to jump in. I think we want to collaborate in doing this, but I was mostly in shock when I read the first article. So I had to call her afterwards and go, what is this really about? And so we discussed this on the phone for like an hour. And then we discussed it again for another hour. And then yesterday we discussed it again for another few hours. And then I started to go, why is it touching me so much? So I think we will get start. Liliana, do you have anything to say?
I just want to say thank you, Gustavo, and thank you everyone here present, Andrew, Dana, thank you. And I will just chime in here and there, prepare some questions. And yeah, I will like just follow Gustavo's line.
All right. Well, in that case, this is new to me, especially trying to present this, but here it is. So I want to start with the second article, so directly going to Fanon, because I think that's how I read the text. So the social therapy in a world of Muslim men, methodological difficulties. And I started to summarize the text as a reporter. And then I didn't realize that that's exactly what was one of the components. So in brief, Fanon is at the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital, and I think it's in 1954. The experiment is to basically look at the institution, but to have and Liliana, maybe I'm not saying this right, but there's a technical word for it, but it's the idea that they're not only looking at the institution, but they're looking at the people and how to actually create some sort of dynamic between the environment, the people, and then what they do in their everyday lives. There's a technical term for it, and I'll look for that briefly. But I did not know that they compared this type of psychiatric ward, and this is the first article. So going to the first article, I didn't know that the ward at those times had tens of thousands of deaths attached to them because they were very cruel, dehumanizing. A lot of the people that I understood died of hunger or atrocious conditions or illness. So there was a comparison with, I think it's with Nazi Germany. So the idea of extinguishing a certain type of people. So I did not know that after reading the first article. So just going back to the second one. So he tries to institute these changes, and there's a division. There's one side that's a division of, I think, female European, and I may be wrong, but I'm just recounting it, patients, and then there was a Muslim side of patients. And what I didn't understand is I thought they were all integrated together because I'm thinking contemporary, but no, they were separate. That was established practice. So I had to think about this more as a kind of a researcher and going, oh, well, Fanon, his professor, actually inspired him to look at theory and practice as one and the same, and how practice can inform theory. And this helped him start the experiment and having two groups. The first group would be the European group, and they would actually they would implement, I think it was a newspaper. So it's kind of implement a bi-weekly meetings. So that would be with staff. So doctors, nurses, and patients. So staff meetings, newspaper meetings, bi-monthly celebrations. That actually caught me by surprise. I thought everyone liked to celebrate. And they do, but differently. I think that's really what it gets down to. They had examples of these type of activities. So tag. So you would think, hey, we all play tag as children. No, we don't play tag as children. Not everyone does. So that's, I think, what was painful about reading this, because I'm a son of an immigrant. So for me, being socialized in this country was evacuating my original heritage and seeing my mother and father go, I have to let him go to survive in this system of oppression. So that's my personal story, but now I step back to the readings. So a game of tag was a problem. Then they looked at the idea of having the writing and reading was a problem. So in the European group, everyone could read and write. There was more of this understanding of writing this journal, having the doctors take the lead on the main article, how everyone could talk about their experiences, but also talk about the overview, the theoretical framework that actually made all of this work for the benefits of the whole, you know. So the doctors cared. And I guess the European patients understood that, hey, I understand the system, I feel safe. And it comes to the movies, they showed movies. Oh my God, everyone understands movies. So at Cal Arts, when I was there, we actually talked about, Rambo, or talked about, gay and lesbian films. And for me, that was natural. I'm like, why are we even talking about it? It totally makes sense to me. But I didn't understand that I was a part of a subset of people that accepted all of those differences, or I was too ignorant to oppose. I was like, oh, this is like food, I'll eat it. But the food is poisoning me. So I think that in the first test group, the European group, there was an acceptance. And I think now we go to the second group, and I probably missed something. So they even played music. And even in music, there was a problem. Okay, so in the second group, which Fanon cites as there was a failure in the original experiment, ultimately it all led to a success. And I think for the hours that Liliana and I were talking about it, this is more into the research that she is talking about, but she'll chime in. The Muslim patients did, and men primarily, did not accept some of the habits. A lot of them couldn't read. A lot of them couldn't write. I think only 2 or 3 patients could read, and I think 1 could write. They chose one person to be a representative because in their culture, and I'm using a horrible they, but let's say in this second group, there's usually one person that's the storyteller, and there's one person that I think is literate to carry on that tradition. So I think that I didn't know that. So that was enlightening too. And I think that's, I think that's what Fanon started to understand. With the failure comes the realization that he's learning. So they couldn't understand the movies. So how could they understand these characters that they have no relation to? That was my experience. I didn't understand most of the movies. I didn't even understand what they were saying most of the time. I just nodded because I didn't want to be beat up or whatever. So I'm thinking like the patient here. Why is the patient not understanding what the doctor wants? So I'm kind of a schizophrenic. I'm the doctor and the patient trying to figure out why these pieces are not working. The music, they didn't understand the music, probably the rhythms, the beat, the understructure, all of it. Why would be, it's noise to them. So I go to Colombia and they're playing death metal at a grocery store. And I saw a mother and a child dancing in front of the meat aisle. And they didn't care about the cussing. They didn't care about the horror or anything. They just saw it as environment. And it's better than the pollution and the horribleness outside of the store. But in that store, it offered them an aesthetic safety. So, but these patients are like, hey, it's death, going back to my jail cell, or you know, listening to this music. I think I would rather go back to my little room that I can feel safe in my own thoughts, even though this is some freedom. So they even protested, because why? Why would they participate? And I think that's kind of where you go, there's a failure. So what does Fanon do? Because he's like, you know what? A lot of my work and my professor's work, and this is where Liliana will correct me, my professor's work, it's about this institutional change. Like, how do you make this overall theoretical framework where everyone works together and that there's purpose? We all heal each other through the process. And it's we as in the patients come first, but it's we as in an institution. So, and I'm telling it like a story because this is how I felt. I felt like I was going through a horror. I'm seeing an accident, kind of a death. And then I'm trying to figure out with the forensics how I can prevent that from ever happening again, which is also it's insanity because you can't. I'm too small. But I think Fanon was like, you know what? I have enough control in this situation where I can walk into, so the first article contextualizes it. He walks into the hospital. The team is primarily European. I'm not going to say white, but primarily a certain type of race, belief system, and educational system, and they oppose Fanon. So what he did is he got younger doctors and interns that agreed with his philosophy of decoloniality, but they didn't use that word. They understood that it was also a revolutionary act to try to change the system. So Fanon goes and travels, I think, with his student around the country to figure out why some of these activities did not work. So they actually went and found films that were more familiar to the culture. They found singers to come in and sing. They actually found content and activities that related more to the male population. So they had like these cafe that he set up, which revolutionary. I think French theorists, the idea is they're all at the cafe, at the street, and they talk and then they fight all day, but they're having a good time in the fighting. Well, that wasn't even an issue in the beginning because they didn't think about it. But at the end, it was like, oh, these activities help. They actually nurture and they care for the patient. And then they empower themselves because they all have an agreed shared reality instead of this other reality that is imposed on them. And they feel, I was using with Liliana the idea of ghosting. They were ghosted. And is it not ghosted? No, what's the other one?
Gaslight.
Gaslighting. So it's a gaslighting. So they've been abused. Their land has been taken away. So this was the background research. Their land has been taken away. Their social fabric has been taken away. And there's an oppressor that's actually implanting a system on them. And they don't understand. So why should they even care? Why should they participate? So calling them, I think, I'm not sure if it was this article, like lazy or whatever the stereotype was of the French to these people. I mean, why are they going to go out of their way if they know that at the end they have no money, they'll starve, and their families will suffer? They have to figure out, they need to gain hope. So that in the second article, they talked about that journey. And then, and I'm not sure if they resolved the second article in that way. So I'll go back to the first article. So in the first article, they tell the story that Fanon did institute a lot of these changes, and actually some of them did take root. And I think that was hopeful. I did, in the first article, they actually cite that Fanon quit a few years later, and then he died a few years later after that. But they actually had a beautiful quote in there, and I'm not sure if I can read it, but it briefly states that, you know, why is he going to be a part of a system that is not going to change ever? Why is he going to support a system that won't accept these basic tenets of human rights? It makes no sense to him. And what I told Liliana on the phone, and I think I was like cussing on the phone, I was like, if I was Fanon, I'd just tell him to fuck off and just leave, because I'm not going to waste my time anymore. Like, it's like a bad relationship going so bad that you're like, no. You know what? I'm not even going to make it that much of a problem. I'm just going to walk away. But at least I'm going to walk away without this rage. I love myself enough to do it gracefully. So I think that's how I imagine Fanon in the second article. He walked away. Then he finished the second book, and I think going back to the first article, I started tearing up at the end because the guy gave his life. And then at the end, he had an assistant typing his words while he was dying. Come on, like, he hates the system so much that in his last breath, he was asking for help. And then that was it. So his flame was extinguished. And then how many countless tens of thousands or millions of people, all that energy and brilliance just, I don't know if I missed anything, but Liliana, I hear you chime in, because after hours of talking, I'm exhausted.
Like right at the moment when I'm like, like, I don't want to cry, but yeah, man, like, I feel you, because in a way, remember the first time I ever chimed into the Quiver group and I mentioned my experiences as a professor here? Well, this is exactly like what we live here. You know, the first years when I came here, we were having faculty meetings because I couldn't speak. You know, the first few years you can't talk. You have to be very careful and quiet because, you know, political games and stuff. And so you have to know who's who and politics, right? So I had to sit there silently, always measuring whether or not I should take the risk. And eventually I did explode before I got tenure. They got to see the real me before I got tenure. And I was just like, I don't give a crap anymore, you know, fuck you guys. The same feeling, you know. I feel like I'm gonna be on my deathbed, like, you know, like, that's gonna be the last, you know, word that I'm gonna say, you know, because we're living this, and the gaslighting is insanely hurtful and angering, right? So the meetings, discussions were about, what are our students like here? What are they like? Let's create a profile of these Latino kids, because most of them are Latino. Not only that, women and first generation commuters, work 2 to 3 jobs, not 1 to 2, 2 to 3. So that means that there's students that work 4, 5. We have one of the highest rates at the CSU level. I believe it's the highest of hunger on campus. That means that our students come and they're hungry. But what they were worried about was not those things. What they were worried about is, why are they lazy? Why don't they come to class? Why did they refuse to do the work? How come they don't listen to me when I'm talking and just take notes on what I'm saying and just basically eat that shit, right? Like, when, even from students I've learned themselves, now that I'm a mentor to many students, because they come to you crying, wanting to commit suicide. I said this already that last time. Wanting to leave school, saying it's not for me, right? And of course, I have my own set of traumas, of my own experiences that I've lived. So this is like regression, a constant like state of regression with students, right? But it's somehow healing because here I am, right? Here I am, and being unapologetically myself as much as possible. Because if I could be unapologetically myself fully, you wouldn't understand jack shit I'm saying. That's just the reality. They wouldn't even understand me. I would just be like a nebula or something that is scary, right? And I still am scary to many people. They've said it themselves. Called me uncivil. I'm not a team player. All these things, right? I don't know my place. So when you're there, you realize, and actually I have footage of an entire course, because I had a student, and I'm going to tell you how we resolve these issues, because I came to this university, there's no opportunities, like there was no opportunity for real life experience, right? There was a lot of disconnection community-wise with the university, even though we're serving the community. And like I said, like more than half the students didn't graduate. So you come to a world that's like, what the heck? But then you look at the professors, right? And there's only a very few professors. They have no knowledge or training in culture or the context under which they're coming to, right? They're coming to Southern California. They should be trained on the context of the culture and the people here. They're not, right? They're not even trained to teach. That's the truth. Most professors are not trained to teach, right? And then they're given, like, we're given too many students to advise, right? It's like similar. It's a very similar situation.
It's similar to Fanon, yeah. That's where it gets very strange.
And it's 2021 in the United States, the land of the free, home of the brave. So you start to figure out, well, I'm Mexican and I'm indigenous mestiza, right? My mother line is indigenous, is a line of resistance, a line of people who fought. And that's where my resistance, I think it comes from that line because it's in my blood. I just can't help it. And also because I learned the stories growing up. I had learned all the history and stuff. So then that's why I have this perspective. And we also have the perspective of poverty. So we do what we can with what we have, even though we're not poor anymore, right? We grew up, we're professors now. I am a professor, you know, the only one in my family, but we repurpose trash, we repurpose things that you would throw out, right? And we use them. So the way that I've been able to, you know, make things work maybe a little, but still I feel like Fanon, sometimes I just hate it. I want to leave. I have a picture of Kronos eating his children and I put academia, right? That's my picture on communication. That's how naked I am now at the institution, you know? But because it's just people are dying. This is just the context here now, but the real thing that's happening is that all this is resulting in death and early death for many people in many different ways, right? So then I said, you know what, I'm gonna do something here because you guys are obviously blaming the students. You don't understand the context under which we're living here. So I started doing an experimental course. All the students show up. They all have something to do. They created a successful event. And it was an event that was around that time, Trump was trying to get elected, and he did. Students were losing it. They were crying in the classroom because they didn't know what was going to happen to their family members. It was a very scary time. And one student in the back, I was just getting tired of this ill information or one-sided education. They said, oh, journalism is, you know, we're talking about journalism, is only for people to write for the highest paying bidder. You know, like that's about money. Journalism has always been about money. And then my brain's like, you know, I was like, Like that's when I exploded, that thing just kind of went, I cracked. And I was like, all right, man, here's a paper written about the first journalists of America, right? Indigenous, Mexican, and Black, African American, and Asian newspapers that were actually made to create events that were social justice oriented, community oriented, and then they went and covered them as journalists so that they can have a voice or a presence in the area. But that's exactly what we did. I said, that moment, I'm gonna design a class. All right, I've already been thinking about this. All you guys that are just graduated and telling me that you need real life experience, you can show up. You don't even have to be here anymore. And they did, which is crazy, right? Like, how does a student that doesn't even want to be in class and is lazy show up to a class they're not even gonna get credit for? If they're lazy, why are they showing up? Like, right? It's because you create a contextualized version of education that is action-oriented with real results in the community and with actual experience. And you incorporate philosophies and theories and ideas that relate to us, that make sense to us.
Yeah,
They're not
Lily,
like, yes.
Liliana, I want to interrupt for a second, but I wanted to say that it sounds as though, just to go back to the article a little bit,
Mhm.
How did I survive a system of oppression? I had to actually be indoctrinated in the Western canon. And I had to be the best student in class, not the best by far.
Mhm.
So it's even the categories of judgment and was so unbalanced. So I was telling Liliana at some point as a kid, I had, Klansmen as neighbors. I had to be more racist than the Klansmen to not get beat up, to not actually be oppressed. And that performance is the performance that you are never yourself.
Mhm.
And why is that? Why aren't people going mad already? So I think it's what I kept saying to Liliana is, I think I've been mad from the start because I don't know who I am as a human being. I've intuited that the friendly people are the people that I go toward, but everyone else I try to hide or to act to survive. That's kind of a weird way of saying it. And this is kind of the mind of the patient here. Like, how would you survive a jail that's so horrible that you see people dying all the time? Well, you probably rely on the kindness of the jailer. And you try to make sure that they care enough to give you a little bit more food or a little bit more space to grow. Anyway, Liliana.
And I've done that here and there, but not always, because another thing that people must understand is that not all experiences of marginalization and oppression are the same. It's like everybody thinks that they should be the same, right? Like I said last time, there's also human condition and the fact that we're dying every second. That's something else, right? Like there's the psyche and stuff, and then there's the actual social political stuff that adds to that, right? And depending on your gender, if you're bisexual or you're gay, like that binary stuff adds to it, right? It's not like I also suffer. I hate that, right? Because that's so dismissive of the complexity of it. And that's one of the pillars of coloniality, which is what Fanon gives, light to here. It's not colonialism anymore because it's like supposedly we have been liberated through independence movements across Latin America and then also Africa and Asia, right? But they happened later after World War II, right? So coloniality are the power structures or the matrix of power that continues on, that kept going on after racialization occurred and racial caste systems were in place. And with them, religion, with them, ideals, philosophies, what we believe to be knowledge, epistemology, and how we relate to it and how we organize it. And that's coloniality. And coloniality is still here because we're still under contracts, national contracts that were created by white men who did not ever involve any of the original natives that lived here, of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, that were not living in little huts. They were empires. And they were even more close together, cluttered than Europeans. Like there were more nations in less space of land, right? So yeah, I mean, my difference from Gustavo, I would say, and from many, is that I grew up on the border. And I would cross the border daily, even sometimes twice, you know? That helped me realize that it was bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, kind of like, your friends will turn on you, you know, that kind of thing. It's a very fast-paced environment. It's a very survivalist area. Like, you have to survive with your wits or with your body, you know? Crossing the border, I could see the performance enacted daily. I could see the repetition. I started to see the patterns. And then I started to create my own comebacks and realizing they couldn't do shit to me because I had papers. They could make me wait for hours. They could torture me psychologically, but at the end of the day, they would have to let me go. I saw that as a quotidian thing to have to pay for being Mexican or for looking like this, to be humiliated on a daily basis. It was just kind of like what was going to happen. So I became like a cholo, kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
like
Liliana,
a gangster. I don't give a shit. I'd rather you fear me than you disrespect me. That's what those things beget. You know what I mean? And I'm just talking about this dimension here with me personally. But there are other dimensions of that. There are just patterns that repeat themselves.
Well, Liliana, before we move on, because we can talk for hours, but I think that, I want to hear other voices too, because I don't know, Dana or Andrew, who picked these articles for what reasons, but like for the last 48 hours, I've literally been like, my heart has been up here because I just don't know, why, because I think, Andrew, you've spoken about this, and Dana as well, like, why are we as human beings, why are we putting up with this abuse? It's just so horrible. If you see your mother being abused by your parent, your father, you would want to leap and protect yourself, put your body in front of that other human being, but that doesn't help. So why aren't we coming together and imagining something that is so different? And that's what this whole Quiver was about. So it's like, what? We're not smart enough in this group to do something. Like, I refuse for that to happen. Like, that's how, and this is not about race now, it's about equity and being human and loving. Why is that so radical? Why do you kill the people that say, I want equality and love, and then you shoot them in the head? And then who's the next person? So anyway, I just want to open it up to everyone else. Sorry about that. And thank you, Liliana, for your story and your thoughts.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, it was Andrew that picked the texts, but it was, I think that Andrew had said that we would read Fanon at some point, but we were putting it in time for later, and I think it was this decision. Thank you for the presentation. It was amazing.
Also, I have to add something I did not say, that the matrix of power, the coloniality of power, was coined by Aníbal Quijano. I'll put the name on the chat, but I highly recommend anything by him.
Great.
Liliana, what was the name of that article, or would you be able to send me the article about early journalists in America?
Sure, yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Can I send it maybe to someone that can send it to everyone? Do you all, if you all want to have, or can I have your email? I don't know.
I'll send you a PM with my.
All right.
You can send it to me and I'll communicate too.
Okay, all right.
You can send it to Quiver also, and maybe we can forward it to the group or something like that with the next meeting, or we can upload it.
All right.
So if nobody wants to say anything, maybe I could say some impressions from the text, and I don't know. Well, I mean, you mentioned all of them, Gustavo and Liliana, and thank you. It was so nice. Maybe I can just rephrase them, or maybe just add them with my own experience, because the truth is that these two texts, they really hit me very hard. They spoke to me for two reasons. The first one is because in Greece we have a series of this type of institutions, mental institutions and all kinds of institutions that they have awful conditions. There is segregation there. They are whole islands that are like islands of outcasts. And also there is a documentary that is called The Island of Outcasts. Also, there is an amazing documentary that I could probably find with English subtitles. The Man That Disturbed the Universe. It is about a mental institution in Crete. And it's one of my favorite documentaries. And there was also a very big scandal with this island, Leros Island, in the late 70s, early 80s, I think. And also Guattari was involved in it, like a psychiatric activist. He wrote the book From Leros to Laborde. And it was a big scandal because the conditions were really horrible. People were just left there to die. It was a huge issue in Europe in the 80s. And even lately, we had, like 2 weeks ago, we had another institution that was a nursery home that had these awful conditions for people living there, and many died. It was in the news. I mean, we have a series of this type of institutions here, and it was for me very strong to see the reasons behind a very specific, setup of institutional life in another country, of course, and another time, but also to see the reasons like how the institutions fail people, used to fail people, and how they still do in some cases. And the second reason is even more personal. It's because reading the text, I realized how much this North African culture and this mentality is very close to the Greek one. And there might be this European and Greek imaginary one that says that we belong to the West. Also, this was a line from an older Greek politician, or that Europe, the word, was a Greek word, or so many words, democracy, like an imaginary. That like this is this common line of Christianity, that unites Europe and whatever this means. A part of the European Union, but culturally, I think we were part of the Ottoman Empire for many years, and we have a lot of common grounds with the Muslim world. And this was for me was very apparent when I was reading the reasons why the Muslim world failed in the beginning. I mean, I could actually visualize how those Muslim men could not conform to a party. What would a party mean for them? Because their gathering was happening around a coffee place, drinking tea, or it was for religious reasons, or it was family gatherings, and they could not match this idea. Or they couldn't write the newsletter because they couldn't write. And also, illiteracy was a huge number in the 50s in Greece as well, in many other places. But being able to write for everybody is a very recent update for some countries, not all of them even today. So this is why it struck me very hard, and also what Liliana was saying is very important as well. I mean, the violence is at all institutions that we pass from. And I see it myself, and I saw it myself, how difficult it was for me to conform to anything during my early 20s. I could not, or even earlier in the school, universities, I could not match. I didn't want to. And I see it now, how difficult it is for my students. It requires a great effort from their part to be able to conform. And how much violence sometimes they experience from the universities, from the other professors, maybe even for me. I mean, I don't say that I am good, and the violence that exists there, the learning system that is there, or from the paradigm, even the field itself. So yeah, Liliana, this is a huge huge topic. These were my impressions. I mean, I don't know if you have any other comments.
Maybe I can jump in here too.
Absolutely.
What's interesting about Fanon is maybe the question, why Fanon? He's basically a third world writer, if we even want to accept that term, which is a strange sort of Cold War relic at this point, who died when he was rather young and who wrote primarily in the 50s and the 60s. And he remains this guiding star of not just one field or one approach, but so many. And so I think the question, why Fanon, is a question that we need to keep asking, because it's one that's so generative and that it raises a lot of important problems, controversies, or issues, perhaps even more than they resolve, which is, I think, why he remains such a important figure for thought, but also because of the readings, or in and through the readings that we should today practice, or even really, from my perspective, the failures of practice. It's really a thinker who helps reveal to us like what doesn't work without giving us a blueprint or a model for what does. And so perhaps there are a few ways to answer the question, why Fanon, at least for me, today. The beginning of how to answer that would be, he was a man who lived fiercely, brilliantly, a number of lives, very quickly, each one sort of at its limit, propelling him to the next. So he grows up in the Caribbean. His intellectual mentor is Aimé Césaire, famously of negritude, which we might sort of relate today to a sort of cultural nationalism, you know, in the United States, at least through groups like Black Power and the Black Panthers. We get sort of Black is beautiful. And this is in part a version of that. And Fanon was deeply inspired and motivated by this, but at a certain point finds its limit and gets pushed further. He then is also motivated at that time by the older French cosmopolitan or even nationalist idea of freedom, thinking that there's some reason he should go to France, to the place that has colonized his own country, to learn from people who are ostensibly more expert or have a more distilled version of freedom than him. And when he arrives, he finds himself incredibly destabilized, and we get that beautiful work, Black Skin, White Masks, in which at least the dynamic that I find most shocking and revealing from his deep personal narrative is that famous chapter, The Lived Experience of the Black Man, in which he's called out on the street as being a Black man, something that certainly wouldn't happen in Martinique, where he grew up, because everyone would be, or nearly everyone there would be Black, right? And he finds this strange dynamic in that moment in which he is no longer a person of his own choosing. A whole chain of cultural and social associations are stuck to him by someone else that he never saw for himself, that he never wanted to be associated with, and he's sort of trapped there. And so that's deeply destabilizing for him. And so it's not enough simply to learn from the metropole then, even though, you know, he trains in this very practical way of becoming a psychiatric doctor. Then he does these series of residencies, as we saw in the historical context for today. If you read the previous sections, he happens upon this sort of strange experiment led by a Catalonian doctor who was part of the anti-fascists and also part of this sort of like strange anti-Stalinist sort of communist movement too. So people were very much about being radicals, but not being conformist or deeply, partisan radicals, who had done this brilliant social experiment, making what had previously been these carceral spaces of the psychiatric hospital into a cafe where everyone is almost living like a commune, flipping, this state of exclusion and incarceration into this almost utopian experiment on its head, which seems sort of brilliant to him. And so then he, gets this appointment in North Africa, and he gets this opportunity to try it for himself, and it fails. Or in fact, what's even more interesting for him is that it works for the European and fails for the Muslim population, who are the people he most identifies with. Though he finds out that the tools and his training and everything that he had worked so hard to become worked for the Europeans, which means that he ended up being aligned with the Europeans and not the Muslims. And so he found himself trapped on the wrong side of a war, literally a war for independence. And so he eventually resigns because he's so disgusted by this fact. And he then suddenly is sick with cancer, and then is in an accident. I think it's an automobile accident, and is in a full body cast. And so dedicates those last few years of his life to running guns for the Algerian independence and creating opportunities for political prisoners and political refugees, and just sort of like really going to the max. Okay, so we have this sort of history, and we have these brilliant texts from each time that does different sort of work. And so there's some fields he draw on just his late work on sort of what is national culture and decolonization, their earlier work on sort of how does it feel to be estranged in this land you thought was your ticket to freedom, or what does it mean to be a practitioner, and we're sort of knitting those together today. Well, here's how I would pose that problem right now too. Each one of these moments is a moment of failure. So he's a theorist who helps us think through these periods and how that each one of them can't really deliver the dream that we want. So it can't enough just to be about finding one culture and promoting it. Those were the failures of Negritude that he moved forward. It's not about expertise. You can't just become an expert in that field and then help other people and say, I'm going to make $1 million and then donate it to all my friends or whatever. Or I'm going to become the perfect teacher and then sort of save people through that. Because he tried that and it doesn't work. And then it's not just bring these experimental tools to a new context, because he finds out he's in the middle of a war based on colonialism and race, and that he finds himself on the wrong side of it. And so he ends on the sort of political revolutionary side. And as we've seen, as Liliana so brilliantly outlined, even if you win that war, the war of arms or the war of territory or the war of the control of a nation state or something, you still can lose because they've colonized your life, or they've colonized your mind, or they've colonized your culture. And so Fanon, for me, I think what's so interesting about the period that we're looking at right now is he's looking at the failure of reforming institutions, saying it's not enough to be democratic. We can roughly say like the reforms he suggests here were democratic reforms. Let the prisoners, or let the psychiatric patients start taking over more control. Give them influence, keep them in the newsletter, have meetings with them where they get decision-making capacity control. Simply democratizing things didn't work. And in fact, it really didn't work for the Muslim population in this particular context. And then one can imagine he would even think even social reforms meant to accommodate for a particular culture or a background of people might fail too, because it's still the fact that it's an institution, it's a psychiatric institution. And I think he himself struggles and gets to the point where he can't even imagine what would a truly good or politically useful psychiatric institution be. And I think that's why he resigns. I think he ultimately says, really, if he believes in mental illness, like it said in the documents, and that mental illness has social causes, that in fact, by being the sort of person tied to studying, working in and through mental illness, he had to abandon the hospital and join the political group, and still uses skills, uses training, still uses worldview of looking through a psychiatric or even just a psychological framework, but that it was more useful in a political context for him than it was in an institutional. No doubt, he didn't live long enough to see how that happened, but I think that raises important questions for us today, being, I'm a teacher. I find myself within a college and university setting. And would it be enough simply for me to democratize my classroom? would it be enough simply to get my students to tell their stories or come from their perspective? And it's troubling to sort of look to Fanon to say, maybe not. Certainly I need to do that. That's the sort of the first step. But he would even say, in that way, I might still yet be teaching them how to be European, how to be good bosses, how to, you know, lead people in all the wrong ways. So anyway, these are my thoughts. That's the sort of direction and the insights that I'm taking from some of these texts.
And what you just said, Andrew, is related to also Paulo Freire, right? Like the way that we think of ourselves as bringers of knowledge, when in reality, we should be learning how to learn from our learners, right? It's what is really like mentorship is really two ways, right? Like I'm mentored as much and nourished as much by my students as much as I nourish and mentor them. And I didn't come here, like something that I want to add is like people assume that because I'm from the border, I knew all these things. You know what I mean? Like I just knew them all. Like, and it's easy for you, you know, it's like, no, actually, no. I went to UC Berkeley. That was my undergrad in rhetoric, right? Then I went to the UC system again for my PhD. I did a pit stop at San Diego State because I wanted to study border literature, Tijuana, because I'm also from Tijuana, right? I said, so I had to learn how to teach and how to learn here in the context of San Bernardino. It was, every semester you learn from your students. They tell you, they give you feedback. And then you find ways of creating greater impact with less busy work because they have busy lives. They overwork themselves, right? So everybody can do this. It's not like, you know, only the colonized or those that come from colonized lines need to be decolonized and liberated. No, liberation is for everyone, for everyone. The colonizers especially need to be decolonized. The descendants of the ones that still believe these ideas are true and center and only the truth of life, you know, like, so that's me saying, look, Fanon did it. I've done it. I know a lot of people have done it. You can do it. Anybody can do this. All you have to do is want to understand different perspectives. And context is so important because I believe that's the major issue here, that we live in a present that's completely decontextualized and it's oversimplified. The complexity of history is hidden to most people. The background, right? Right now, people are studying algorithms, right? That's the thing now, the discourse is how algorithms are, again, used to program us into being in a certain way. And then the algorithms are programmed by us, we're feeding them coloniality, and they're giving us coloniality back. And, you know, that's, again, how the cameras don't see certain skin tones. They don't even perceive them, right? There's a lady in MIT, I forget her name, but I'll look her up right now and I'll show you a link to her work where it's saying basically what we're doing is just revamping once again. It's coloniality 8,500 billion zillion 0.0, you know, like it's just kind of like a revamp of those systems across dimensions.
I wanted to chime in also. I would say to Andrew, I mean, thank you, and thank you, Dana, also for your thoughts. Dana, what you said kind of touched me a little bit because when I go back to Colombia, there are institutional problems and there are issues there too that kind of divide who I am as a human being. But I would say that in my experience, I didn't really understand why I was a good teacher. And then ultimately what I realized was I had compassion and empathy for others first, because I had to understand where I was as a person in a system that did not understand me. So I was basically trying to give those survival skills to any student that wanted to learn because they were also kind of drowning. But as soon as you teach them how to swim, then they only want to know that you're there for them. And when I went back to the text, I kept thinking, that's what Fanon is doing in a strange way. He's making sure that the people that he cares for, that they know that he's there for them. And then they can feel safe enough to try to get better on their own terms. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a beautiful way of thinking about teaching. But like Fanon, it's like at some point, you can't be a part of a system that destroys you along the way, because then you have nothing to give to the students or your family or even yourself. So I think that's kind of my little take, but if anyone else wants to chime in.
Hello. I was reading this and I was really thinking, I'm not familiar with this amount of Fanon's work, but I've read Wretched of the Earth many times. I'm pretty familiar with, well, Red Skin, White Mask was what I'm more familiar with by Glenn Coulthard. But when I was reading this text, two things were coming to mind. And one was specifically like, what am I doing in the projects in my life? This one included, among other things I'm involved with. Like bring more people in for the people that I want to speak to. I was thinking, how would that look for if we are going to write something? But I was also thinking with Wretched of the Earth, I really felt that when I read that book, I hear Fanon tried to escape all of this. Like you said, Andrew, like this was a failure. Like he didn't see a way out through teaching or being a doctor in these colonial systems. And I wonder, for me personally, I don't really see a way out towards the liberatory mode of life I want to live through going to college. I do see it as a good opportunity and a good job compared to most other ones. But I think that Wretched of the Earth really shows that Fanon saw that there wasn't really hope or a way out through what he was doing, specifically as a Black man, as a colonized person. And very specifically, you know, in these pieces, he's talking about like, what can I do for these colonized people? But in Wretched of the Earth, he straight up says that the first thing that needs to happen is colonialism must die. And that in order to do that, violence is necessary. And I was wondering what that meant for our group, because I couldn't take the violence part out of my head when I was reading this. And you know, I know some people argue like that's metaphorical, but I think that's bullshit. I mean, he's literally running guns. I think he was thinking that there was something that was changing the way that he felt in his soul through that revolutionary violence. And any of the people that I trust doing organizing work with, specifically Indigenous people in the American Southwest. That's my familiarity with Fanon, is with those people and the revolutionary violence and the critique of the system. And I think I'm just kind of going on now, but I was wondering if anyone else had those connections about violence. And also, I thought that the self-critique was a very good point. Thank you.
I wanted to say just a little story. This is a child story, but at one point, you know, to survive a system of oppression, I had to become the most out there racist, brutal athlete. Like I trained the most, I was the most dehumanized, I became an agent to survive. And I remember at one point where I was confronted with violence, and the first thing I did was return violence more. And to actually be the alpha, which doesn't even exist. But I had to prove a point that if I was going to be violated, I was going to violate others more without limit. And then I started to cry because I knew that that wasn't me. but I had to do it at that moment because I was ignorant. I don't know where Fanon, with all of his intelligence at the end, is helping to aid more death. Like that, I can't make that leap right now. But what I can do is I can honor the people that love me, and I know that is more transformational than to leave bodies. So, I mean, maybe Andrew or Dana can jump in, but I think transformation is very important here.
May I respond to this? Okay, so violence has been occurring. Blood sacrifice has kept countries and power structures the way they are today. So is the question about the fear of white lives being killed, or like, the violence upon white people though? Like, that's my question though, because violence and murder and death have been ongoing for 500 years. Even if you can't see it, it's happening all over the world and here, right? So is our concern with the violence turning onto the oppressors that are, like onto the system? That's my first question. And then the second point I want to make is I want to share with you what I know, right? From my professor, who I really love, my professor, Enrique Dussel. I don't know if you've ever heard of Enrique Dussel. And he talks about how modernity was a project. Modernity was a project, and it begins in the Enlightenment period, right? And it moves forward into, he talks about how Europe is presented as exceptional, that's exceptionality of Europeans, and how that then is later inherited onto the United States because they're the same people, right? And so, this is an ongoing project, right? So if modernity is a project, it is possible for us then to purposely enact. Well, if this wasn't done on purpose by a group of evil men in cloaks, like it was done systematically, but it wasn't like we're planning it, right? So if that was done, why can't we sit together and actually plan a project towards trans modernity? So what goes beyond this idea of we are the future. The humans are all in a race. In Europe, we're in the front. And so we mark everything that's at the front, what surrounds our identity and what we've accomplished. That becomes the most futuresque ability of humankind. For example, to think that because we have computers, we're more advanced, or because we have a system of capitalism that we're more advanced, instead of trading, which is seen as something from the past or something that is less advanced. When in reality, we can think actually, the environment was taken into consideration in those systems. And I would say that's probably where we want to go to in the future, which is probably what most people are thinking about right now, which is how do we save our environment? How do we stop being assholes, right, to our Mother Earth? When this is seen as something that a future of Eurocentric perspective of European modernity, of the myth of modernity, in fact, we're going back into these indigenous ways, into these ways that other cultures have done things where actually they had it right 500 years ago and beyond, right? So the project of modernity tells us what? And this is Enrique Dussel. This can change because it changed. It wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way that we know it now. It's not like they're gods and this is just the way it's going to be. No, it's going to take a long time, but surely it will take a lot less than how many, 700 years that it took modernity to get us to this point today, right? So there is a future, right? There is a way to change things. I believe that to think that there isn't is probably him surviving in that moment. I mean, I'm not seeing people die in blood, like he saw people die. Like he talked to traumatized people who have been tortured by the French army, and he saw that around him, right? So then what ends up happening is you want to give up, like you want to leave, So that's like your body suffers, and women of color are more likely to die because of heart attacks. And this is like this is documented in scientific studies. And as you can see, like the response is already starting, right? People are immediately angry or don't want to hear certain things, and we're used to that, but it gets tiring. And so, Fanon threw the towel, like many people who do this kind of work do. And I wouldn't judge and say that he gave up. I said, he probably, his spirit, his self was so in such detriment that he had to choose between his health and well-being or doing the work, No, but I'm talking about, he took arms, but I'm talking about the daily, every day, you lose it. That's why I always ask, what would happen if we had a Mexican Joker, like the South Park, that they make fun of it, right? So what would happen? Well, how come there isn't one? Anyway, those are just questions I have. The violence has been ongoing, and it's not going to be a new thing.
I mean, that's a good point that Liliana talked about. And I think that's where, maybe I'm trying to be, I'm revealing my heart. So let's just say it. Yeah, if you really think about it, our system has destroyed and killed in the past. It still does now. Why are we putting up with it? So I guess if you saw the Biden speech, you would say, hey, he's not Trump, but he's still doing the same things, just less so. And I bet you if it was your child or someone that you loved and cared for more than life itself, would you put up with it? And I think that's where our system breaks down. If we cared for each other, I think we would make change now. But bullshit, we don't even care enough to care for our neighbor. And I think that's, to me, the American system that I hate the most. I love my neighbor. Hey, actually, when I met Andrew, the first thing I said is, hey, I love that man. He made me wake up at that moment because I was asleep.
Hey, I guess just to jump in real quick, I really liked what Andrew had to say, and I could relate to like what Alex had to say. It was kind of interesting to read this because the last time I read The Wretched of the Earth was probably like 20 years ago now. And I really enjoyed it. And I still can, in some ways relate to it. But as I was reading even Fanon's own account, like all I could think was like, Fanon's a colonizer, like 100%. So here's a guy that grew up, middle class, son of a customs agent. I believe his mother was a shopkeeper in Martinique. They sent him to the best high school period in Martinique. He goes off, he fights in wars, comes back to France, gets a degree in psychiatry, which arguably is the colonization of the mind, and then goes and takes this European framework built on Western values, applies it to a group of European women and a group of Arab men. And even the fact that he had the mind to go ahead and do that, like almost seems sort of bizarre. And when he gets all the way to Wretched of the Earth, it's like he's still using sort of colonial solutions. He's taking the arbitrary lines drawn in the sands of Africa by European men and building the idea of nation states around them, which to me, again, is kind of bizarre because those lines would seem very arbitrary if you were to actually go and look at the cultures, within them and how they're distributed. So it was very interesting to see he was also self-conscious about it and he recognized it. And I know it's a pretty typical criticism of Fanon after the fact, and like a post-structuralist criticism would be that he did carry all of those Western values on in his decolonial project. And that's kind of what I heard in what Alex was saying too. It's almost if Fanon takes this approach, like, is he not serving the same role is he not just recreating a new form of the colonial society, like in different clothing? Is it a different exterior, but it still has the same kind of, it's going to have the same result at some point because you're still focused on homogeneity. And that's another criticism of Fanon, that, and I guess you could probably take this down a very Deleuzian kind of route and say psychiatry in the way it was being practiced, in the way that he was attempting to practice it in the first place, and then the idea of nations, being the destruction of difference rather than the respect for it. So I don't know. I guess I had some kind of, I also had feelings about it because I've spent a little bit of time in a place like that. And though I wasn't tortured by anyone or had any of those things happen to me in a war, I'm extremely cynical about psychotherapy, kind of period, and how you really can't separate it from the dominant culture as much as you try to, simply because of where it's coming from, where the theory comes from, and the fact that if we're going to assume that everyone should be happy, well-adjusted, and relatively neurotypical to get by in society, like, should we question the society or question the neurodivergence?
Just before, thank you, Josh. But before we move on, Brendan has had his hand, and he was been very patient. So, Brendan, do you want to say something? Thank you again, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to call attention to one thing in the text that, I found this text very moving in many different directions. And I think the thing that really stuck out to me was the way that Fanon lands on this idea that like a therapeutics that's mediated through language or through art or through culture is always going to run up against these barriers, particularly in terms of like when a language does not cross. There's something sort of comical about the fact that it's a 19-page diary, and the final conclusion was, we probably should have learned to speak Arabic. And so the one thing that I thought was really sort of interesting about the text was that when they realized that the Muslim patients weren't reacting to the cultural therapy, their first thought was, well, they really like the action movies. Maybe we should show more of those, which kind of raises the question of what Fanon would think of, a superhero movie today. These sorts of just like loud, effective cinema. I think, there's the famous article of Martin Scorsese comparing them to theme park rides and something like that. And this idea that one of the things that breaks through the barrier is something that's effective and not necessarily logical or reasoned. All of which is to say that I feel, on the one hand, you could take it as maybe Quiver should be producing action films, since they do so well. But on the other hand, I think it also just raises the question, and this is something that I think you keep coming back to a lot, Gustavo, which is like, what is immediately available? Like, what is sort of the margin of coding that each of us has available to us to work with? And that's sort of my feelings from this text.
Yeah, I wanted to note something from the text too. I thought that it's really great insight, Brendan, that it wasn't just like movies in general. There's this like really nice moment where they're like, what kind of movies worked? And, they tried putting on a Western movie that had people in Arabic dress, which was this very much like Orientalist parody of, Middle Eastern culture. And they're like, hey, that didn't work. I wonder why. Oh, it's because it's still just basically like aping or trying to do this Orientalist like fantasy projection that has no relationship to the referent itself. But there's also this sort of few pages within the reading that were a little like they came off as a little abstract or maybe a little bit historical, but they're the ones that actually really caught my eye after getting all the interesting examples of their attempted sort of interventions that worked for some, certainly didn't work for others. And it was pages 364 to 367, in which they're like, okay, here's the big method question, or even methodological. They're like, if we are to turn our attention to, let me see the exact wording, I want to get it precise. What actually are the, quote, biological, moral, aesthetic, cognitive, and religious values of Muslim society? And then how would that allow the native to react from affective, emotional point of view? And then they go on to talk about all this. And so you'd imagine this to be like a kind of a scary moment, because you're like, okay, are they going to now stereotype this culture that he's been living in for, I don't know, like a year or two? He's going to sort of try and summarize it all like social scientists and anthropologists always do in this attempt to sort of like speak down and condescend to people or something. But they also reveal these sort of interesting things that start happening. They're like, okay, one might assume that Muslim culture is this, and so they give some sort of like general sort of points on it. But then they're like, and we need to understand how French settlement also undid and transformed these aspects of the so-called traditional Muslim culture there. And so they're like, before the French came, there was certainly poverty, but it was rather equalized, and there weren't people who seemed to be directly excluded. You'd have to look at the history to know how precise that is. Maybe there were a few people who were very excluded, but they're like, what the French did is they proletarianized. So that means that there were then some ultra rich, and then some people who didn't even have the means of subsistence. They couldn't live. And so those people suddenly need to go somewhere, and so they get psychiatricized, and they get put in an institution. And so they're already coming up with sort of like, why are the causes? Why is mental illness now a thing where historically that might not be of how the society or the culture dealt with it? So their argument here is ultimately like the capitalist elements of colonialism. And then though, thing that really sort of gets me, you see, then starts going into being like, and one might just sort of assume all of Algeria is the same. They're all the same. They're all the same people. And it's like, no, actually, there are these conflicts and differences. There's nomadism. And how do we theorize nomadism in relationship to the other people? And how might this nomadic way of life actually been stopped through settlement, which through the French colonization, property ownership and management of property suddenly became important. And so the nomads then found themselves in a society and a culture that no longer had a place for them. So them too were the people who then get thrown in the institutions. But then the conclusion is sort of interesting one that sets up other approaches too, which is it also gives people a place to start being critical on the culture where they grew up and that they knew, which is what Marx and Engels famously say in the Communist Manifesto. And they say, for better or for worse, people start then questioning the family structure. And they say, is the family structure that we inherited, that we were taught as just simply tradition, is this what we need or want? And it allows something like feminism to come into existence. Now, of course, there are kinds of problems with bourgeois white feminism, but we start getting this other category that I think Fanon really doesn't know how to deal with. It's not just the Europeans, and it's not just the Muslims, it's people in transition who are neither immediately tied to traditional values that you could just sort of return to, nor it's people, the other are people who are not trying to just become European, right? So it's neither like the sort of manufactured future of the European progress, nor the sort of romantic past of we had it all figured out until the French came here, so we just need to return to what we had. There's this other group of people who find themselves in transition. They're being ground through by this new form of French property and possession and entrepreneurial spirit that allows some people to become very rich, but then also has some excluded people who can't even live anymore, and people who've lost their sort of culture and tradition because there's not a place for it, but they might not even necessarily want to go back to it now. And I think this is perhaps the most sort of dynamic territory for Fanon, and he just sort of like doesn't necessarily know what to do with it, but maybe this is what sets him up for Algerian independence. I think this is it. I think Fanon thinks that the future of Algerian independence are people who are not returning to some sort of pure system that had been violated, but they're coming up with a new notion of independence and freedom for themselves. And I think it then gets trapped in this problem that Alex and Josh identified, which is what model of freedom, what model of independence? Is it merely a European one where you have a nation state of a people that you call a people, a nation that's your own, and then you can sort of create a constitution around it or say that there's a very specific way of life? I think that's challenging, and I think that of the many varieties of Fanonianism, which go all the way, I don't know if people are familiar, but there, throughout Africa, there are even political parties that call themselves Fanonian, right? And so they return to Fanon as their political spirit. South Africa has a very, very present Black consciousness movement with elected officials and parties and everything, where it's like their main theorist is Fanon. Of course, the Black Panther Party There's also the Latin American version of Fanon. There's even, in the United States, Afro-pessimists have recently been reading Fanon not as a colonial or decolonial thinking, but as a Black studies thinker, which means that there are different things at stake. So, there's simply not just one Fanon, of course. But I think this gets us back to this question of violence that we were thinking about as well. Like, what is Fanonian violence? If Fanonian violence is merely the limited necessary amount of violence that it takes to found a nation state, then Josh is absolutely right. Then there's nothing terribly unique or novel about what he's sort of saying, and we can just study the whole 500-year history of how European nation states have modernized themselves through all kinds of different forms of violence, from gunpowder to drones, and then we'd have our sort of answer. There's also another version of Fanonian violence that might be, certainly physical because people lived and died by this, but that was partially symbolic in nature. This is how, for instance, Jean Genet reads the Black Panthers. In the French preface to Blood in My Eye, he argues that the Panthers were a version of poetic or symbolic violence, which of course, if we're ungenerous to, we're just like, oh, that means it's purely for play or display or something like that. But I think what actually might be going on if we say symbolic violence, especially if we use these psychiatric categories that we're looking at here, it means it's not the interpersonal violence. It's not theft or robbery or mugging or anything like that. It's not violence purely on the element of the Lacanian real, which would be to disrupt people, to just simply provoke in perhaps the most violent and traumatic ways. Symbolic violence, if it's really in the Lacanian symbolic, means the structure of a society. And you understand what are the codes of a society and where you need to literally attack and disrupt them. And in that way, I think that's something that the Panthers really did. They symbolically disrupted what it meant to be Black. In part, it was through the self-defense programs, survival programs from self-defense, but also feeding children. A lot of the contemporary American welfare state is an attempt to catch up to what the Panthers were doing. Free lunch programs that happen in the United States in high schools is borrowing from and stealing from this legacy of the Panthers, right? Doesn't mean we should necessarily celebrate it because of this, but these are the sort of dynamics that are being set up. And so I think if we think of Fanon not as this like a performance or appearance figure, like on a stage, but if we think of him as identifying symbolic elements of society and applying enough force to topple them, which obviously means taking up arms sometimes, but that it's not just a Leninist game of war where you capture the king and then somehow the nation state's yours and you win. I think that's one reason that the violence remains a sort of important question, and that we shouldn't metaphorize it too much, but also we shouldn't take it as too literal because it doesn't necessarily work out.
Andrew, since you brought up the Afro-pessimists, I wanted to ask Gustavo and Liliana if they've use the Afro-pessimist conception of social death at all in the discussions with their students about kind of what they're going through. Because Liliana, especially some of the conditions that you described for your students, it sounds very similar to things that Frank Wilderson talks about in Afro-pessimism. Sort of being written out of society completely, just by definition of what is human and what is not.
For me, I do not use Afro-pessimism as much as I use Chicana queer theory, which is more about understanding the fragmented experience or the fragmentary identity, and then seeing that as a way of empowering yourself. So seeing it not as something that is hurting you. It is, it hurts you, but then you can pick up the pieces and become a powerful entity through that fragmentation, right? So I wouldn't say I'm much into the Afro-pessimism as much as I am into the indigenous liberation and poetry, and more of a, how can I say this? I'm not gonna say I'm an optimist. I'm just kind of like, it's, I want to help my students redefine their experience that they're having now, but not without hiding the history or the context under which we, But no, I don't use Afro-pessimism as much. No. I like reading it, but it's not in the classroom.
When you talk about fragmentation, like in what ways are they fragmented, and how does that, like, how do you use that to sort of build like a new base of power for them?
So this is Saint-Albian thought. I always have to give credit, right? Because it's like people think it's me, but it's not. It's just that I read these things and I remember, and then I apply them to my work. In the way we're fragmented is the following. I can speak of myself. Story time, right? I am, like I told you, European, but I'm also indigenous, and I'm more indigenous because the mental state of resistance has been given to me. But I don't know the language of the Kumeyaay. I don't know the language or the customs. I'm not part of any tribe with a certificate. We were born at the border, and we've always been moving back and forth, but the tribe was separated. And some people were going to separate further through marriage, which was what happened to my ancestors, right? Like what my great-great-grandma married a man who took her away. And then that was it, and not certified, because when they asked them to come and certify themselves, some natives and American Indians went and did it because they wanted to be certified as tribal members, and others did not because they were afraid. They didn't know what they wanted. And if they wanted to take the little bit of things that we had, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
At the same time, I am also Spanish and German on my grandpa's side, on the father's side. And also they're very Catholic, right? And you grow up with this already, right? As a Mexican woman from the border, I grew up with this difference within myself, in the family, but then also as a Mexican national, right? I'm not Mexican when I go to Mexico City because I'm from Tijuana, right? Or I'm not Mexican enough. When I'm here now, I'm seen as an immigrant, even though I'm not, even though these are the lands of our ancestors. And we've been here for 600 generations, right? 600 years before, sorry. Any other, Europeans or anybody else. And yet I'm seen as a foreigner in my own land. And I speak Spanish and I'm looked at funny. When I speak English, I have an accent. And then you're not from here, right? So like that's the fragmentation of the person, is because what are you then, right? And then there's these words, Latino. What does that mean? Chicano. Well, I'm not from the 70s, right? Like, I'm not from the 60s. The kids think that, right? It's like, it's not about that. It's politics, right? It's like liberation. So then that's a fragmentation, right? Where's my home? Where am I from? Right? This is my country. I wouldn't say it's my country. I can't. I don't feel like it is, but it's my land. I feel like this is my land. It's my place. But I don't feel the country represents me. That in itself, though, it gives you what Gloria Anzaldúa says, it gives you both serpent and eagle eyes. Because you live in Nepantla, and Nepantla is the third space, or the in-between, where you're existing regardless of whether or not you're something or the other. You don't decide, you don't need to decide. You're both and more, right? So let's add. Instead of deciding, you add, you complexify yourself. And that's how you become powerful, because you can see things from different perspectives, and you can see, oh snap, you're not seeing the whole picture. Oh snap, you're not seeing but you're not seeing the whole picture either, but you're seeing more of it because you're in different places. And not only that, you're being contested as a person, as a human being, as a thinker, as someone that has a brain, right? Yeah. And someone that can propose things, right? And sometimes people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear you. They hate you. Just your presence angers them. My presence itself is it's a bad word, So that's empowering in the sense that I'm like, well, you know what? I'm not afraid anymore. Like I am afraid, but it doesn't stop me anymore, ever. And I'll fight you. That's how I am. I'll fight you, and then I'll hug you after, and we'll have lunch together. For me, the fight is not to the death, where I'll burn you and you're done. You know what I mean? It's like, I'll show you how you're wrong and how you keep being violent in many different ways. If you don't want to, then I'll do what Fanon did. Fuck it. So but that's like when I'm empowered, right? Because sometimes when you're so disempowered, like you can't even do that. You can't even advocate for your own health. Right? So that's how I apply that whole, like, the fragmentary existence. What are you? There's a Hispanic money grant going around. Okay, I'm Hispanic then. That's what you want to call me. All right. Like, it's like I'm Hispanic right now, but I'm not Hispanic. See what I mean?
I do.
So that's more like going towards the fluidity of being, and just moving around and stuff, and learning different contexts, different languages, expressions, etc. And then being able to critique them.
No, I wanted to chime in to answer your question. No, Brendan, I'm mostly a practitioner, but I think, like, Andrew reminded me of an old philosophy professor I had at Cal Arts. His name was Sandy Cohen, and literally, I think I absorbed philosophy like water and air. But I would say that I've always thought about the human element first. And I think when talking about Fanon, I mean, my mother was trained as a nurse, and then I'm the third generation architect in my family. So the idea is, how do we design a new future? How do we analyze every little bit to make sure that we know our place, and then we can invent something new? So for me, it comes down to the human element. Like, what would be more violent, hitting you or loving you? I think that's what I really don't know in a culture that doesn't make you confront your true self, because they both kind of wake you up in different ways. And then I kept thinking about, I think Liliana and I talked about, Martin Luther King or, Malcolm X. It's, at some point, if you start talking about love, you start talking about everyone is elevated so that there's a freedom, you're a threat to power. And then that is also another trap. Like, so I think this reading group has made me confront just really where I'm at as a middle-aged man. Like, I think for the first 20 years, I didn't know who I was because I didn't have identity or knowledge. The second 20, I think I became a revolutionary, but then I had to indoctrinate to survive. And in the PhD, I've had the freedom to wander, and I'm not trapped by my body or intellect. Now I'm looking for people that share the desire for change. And that's all I want, is to be in that flow. And this group provides that opportunity for me. But then I asked the group, then what? Like, now I'm going to be the person in the group that brings coffee and brings cakes and then makes really good stories. But then when they say, hey, Gustavo, you're kind of getting too close to me, it's weird. It's like, what do you mean? I'm loving you like I would love my brother or sister. I'm sorry that violates the American code of whatever it is. So I've never been truly one culture, and that's okay. And when I read Fanon, I kept thinking, you know what? I'd rather people think that I'm crazy, because at least I'm true to myself. So anyway.
Wow. I was also thinking how, just to change a bit, but I was also thinking what Andrew was saying before, and how interesting and how relevant what you were saying, Andrew, before. Some of the things you were saying is also, were also for the refugee crisis today, the last decades. I mean, I know we have a lot of, we mentioned many situations that are in between, in constant transition, but also the refugee crisis is an issue like that. And the previous decade, most of all, with Syria collapsing and a lot of environmental and financial migration from all over. And now there is this new form of institutional life, not the mental institution, but we have camps all over Europe. I don't know how the situation is in the US. I'm not informed as well at all. We have actual camps, people living there, they're not allowed to get out. They are asylum seekers, but it goes on for 3-5 years. So it is like a prison. And we have them all over in Spain, in France, in Greece, in Italy, in Lampedusa, we have many. So I kind of find that this text is contemporary also in the sense, but of course not, because it talks about a case that failed and why it failed. But this whole self-reflection of the situation, I find this very, very useful right now. And of course, I cannot claim to have any answer, nor does Fanon. But of course, I can see him like a colonizer, like Josh was saying before. But I don't know, I would say that maybe his contribution is that today we think of this as self-evident and we discuss about it, but it was not at all like that in the 50s. So this is at least something. And about this violence that keeps coming, that also Gustavo mentioned and Liliana as well, I personally, I cannot say that violence is one thing and that, I'm not a violent person and I don't support murder or, I don't know, genocide, but there are various types of violence and various types of counter-violence, and I don't disagree with all of them. And I don't know, it exists and we have to cope with it. And what I'm thinking also all this time is that we know the problems. It appears like we all know the problems and we all know this violence and what we experience from this violence and how we go through this violence flowing around it or transitioning into things that, to survive and to exist. But, nobody really fits the norm today. This is how I feel, that this is the norm is that you don't fit in. We could go back to Deleuze and Guattari again about the external and internal third worlds and the global souths and the souths inside in the periphery and inside the capital. Nobody is, somehow we never get to be normal or happy here. So this disenchantment, sorry, excuse my English. I think that we can see from these failures that come from revolutionary intentions and the failures of reforms with the best intentions, at least where they were there, here in psychiatry, but other as well, political ones. And, maybe to really see how we can use them to find new tactics and how to use them now. Maybe the problems are also different, but also we have to find the new tactics that will serve us. I don't know, this was my thought. It's something that we discuss and we have discussed it before. We still keep discussing it. Maybe it can be in our publication as well. We need to do something. I cannot say, I agree with Gustavo when he says, so what to do? I understand you, but I think that we have to do a lot of work to find out what to do. You know what I mean?
Well, Dana, this is what I would say. If you're my enemy, the first thing that I would do is try to hug you, because I don't really know what else to do. Because I don't want to hurt you, because if I hurt you, I hurt myself. And if I turn away, I'll be afraid that you'll hurt me. And then I won't be there for my family. So in a strange way, it's like, I don't know. My first instinct is to always come and to be warm, right? But then I become the victim. So yeah, you're right. Maybe it's about thinking about this in a totally new way. And new as in, with all of our knowledge here, how do we come up with a way just to, maybe it's a creative thing, maybe it's a text thing, maybe, we, at the conference that I'm helping to organize, we have Zizek that's going to come and speak. Is he someone that's contemporary? Is he really speaking to truth to power? Is he a part of this system? Like, I don't know, can you and Andrew come and actually challenge him and go into a debate? You know how they do in the weird things on YouTube? Like, what does that even produce? Like, I don't know. But I do know that what we're doing here is a first step. And going back to the idea, Andrew was very right, and you, violence, like how do we define violence? I mean, I think a few years ago, I was told that in my program that I called everyone family. And a professor came up to me and said, "You're actually triggering me, because you're violating my comfort because I hated my family. I know what you mean, but I don't want you to ever say it again." So I kept thinking, is he so broken that he doesn't want to accept a love of a stranger? It's a very strange thing here. So you're right. I think we're all kind of I think. Did you see like the Island of Misfit Toys? There's this weird animation that came out in the 70s. I feel like a broken toy abandoned in an island, and like I always want a child to be my friend. But I think I'm the child, the broken toy, and then also I can make my own determination. So why do I need someone else? You know, it's a very complicated picture.
I want to do a wrap up with my last thought, which was something that Leon was talking about, which is how, you know, there's sort of a difference between maybe like the white conception of violence, which is sort of an eternal violence, and like what she talks about, which is you can have an argument and end with a hug and go get lunch, which is like a violence with an end. And it brings back to mind this idea of cruelty and debt, and then how debt was rendered infinite when we sort of moved into a writing system within universal history. One of the things that I've sort of been stuck on for the last couple of weeks is this idea that there isn't yet a literature of kindness that exists in the world. And that's sort of the thing that, like, if I wanted to make sort of a change, or if I wanted to contribute something to sort of the human project, like, how would that work? How would I make a literature of kindness that sort of, it can be violent, but there's an end to the violence, as opposed to an eternal violence that just propagates itself?